A week has passed since this country went through another horrific trauma. 31 of our fellow citizens were killed by gunmen in Dayton and in El Paso, Texas. 31 people. In a situation like this, people play the blame game, especially politicians. Democrats are blaming President Trump. Republicans are blaming Democrats. These type of events have taken place in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. To place blame on any single individual is silly. It's very silly. There's a problem much deeper. Politicians then come up with plans. Everybody has a plan that's going to solve all the problems so that it will never happen again. Now, I'm not opposed to some of the plans, but they have to be looked at very carefully. How do you keep guns out of the hands of criminals? How do you keep guns out of the hands of people who are mentally, emotionally unstable? And so politicians begin to talk about better background checks. Not a bad idea. Some talk about red flag laws, meaning that you can flag down people who seem to be dangerous either to themselves or to other people. Once again, doesn't sound bad. Except we have to look at these laws very, very carefully, because what can happen is that people can be denied their constitutional rights if we just apply with a broad stroke laws that are meant to keep guns away from dangerous people. What do I mean by this? Second Amendment exists for a purpose. There are those that saying, well, maybe it's obsolete, the amendment. Maybe we should get rid of the amendment, or maybe make some adjustments as to who can and who cannot have a gun. The problem is we might have a constitutional issue. Constitutional issue is that before somebody can be denied a right, they have to commit a crime. And so the laws have to be looked at, the legislation proposed has to be looked at very, very seriously. When we talk about the Constitution, and especially the amendments, it would be very foolish to toss out an amendment because we think it's not practical anymore, or it doesn't fit our mindset or our worldview. Because if we eliminate the Second Amendment, well, what's to say that the First Amendment won't go next? Freedom of speech and freedom of religion, of those who think that religion and speech are dangerous. There's an old expression that we learn in law school, tough cases make for bad laws. So we have to be very careful as to how we try to correct what is unfortunately becoming more and more common in our society, the act of domestic terrorism. Now, the problem is very, very deeply rooted, but most people don't think very deeply, including politicians. Politicians, of course, have an easy solution to everything. And if you just elect them, everything is going to be fine. They have a plan. What's the problem? The problem is one that is much more what we call metaphysical. It is a spiritual problem. America is involved with what we'll call a spiritual malaise. Spiritual problem means that there is a vacuum of good. A vacuum has opened up, and the good is absent from that vacuum. And whenever there is a vacuum of good, evil seeps in. There was a book written, I suppose, 20 years ago. It's called Glimpses of the Devil, written by a psychiatrist who began his career as an atheist. And he noticed that in some of the people that he was treating, there was something that was maybe beyond psychiatry, something he just could not explain, couldn't get his arms around it. And he began to realize that he was dealing with evil. He was dealing with evil. And he then began to apply to his practice exorcisms to those that he thought were possessed by the devil. And he said, all it takes for the devil to make an entry into a person's life is a small little crack, a small little incident. And that's where the devil begins to move in. And in some of these cases of domestic terrorism, there is no other explanation. But we did get a glimpse. We did get a glimpse of the devil. The shooter in Dayton, in his scrawlings, in his notebook, was hailing Satan. The devil outed himself. He was there. But we don't hear about Satan because we live in a secularized society that wants to deny the supernatural. Not only the devil, but even we're at the point of people denying God himself. Now, how do we reclaim the vacuum and refill it with goodness? How do we get back into the public square and bring goodness back into the picture to inform people of what is right and what is wrong? Well, there are some things that we can do. Things that we have to do, or else the carnage will never end. It will never end, mark my words. We would be very, very foolish to think if we passed certain laws, even if we got rid of guns completely from the country, that violence would come to an end. Let me tell you something. Bad guys always get guns. People with mental problems always get guns, and there are many other ways for madmen, possessed men, to kill. Guns are not the only way that violence is perpetrated. So let's not look at little simple solutions. But what are some of the things we can begin to do to reclaim the public square? The first thing is this: God has been dismissed from our schools. Do you think that these young men over the past 20 years who have perpetrated these horrendous crimes, do you think they went to school and heard there is a God? I doubt it. Do you think they heard about the 10 Commandments? 10 Commandments were removed from the schools. What about the commandment, thou shalt not kill? Did they hear that one? I doubt it. And so God has to be replaced in the schools. Secondly, the churches. The churches have ceded their moral authority. Not just the Catholic Church, the mainline churches. Instead of preaching and teaching the commandments, instead of preaching and teaching the Judeo-Christian truths found in the Bible, we simply have platitudes telling us to be concerned about the ecology. I have nothing against people concerned about the ecology, but what about the commandments of God? When have you heard a sermon against divorce? If you look at the lives of these young men, young white men, over the past 20 years who have perpetrated these horrendous crimes, they come from broken families where there is no male image present. And we know from our sociological studies the difference that a man makes in the family and that men make in the neighborhood to keep law and order, to keep the family safe, to keep the community safe. The family is the basic building block of society. Fathers are important. And yet the church has, for the most part, kept quiet about how dangerous divorce is to family life and to society. Let me give you another example. I've been reading about a situation taking place in New York City. Did you hear about dousing? To douse someone? Young people are filling up buckets of water and dousing police officers, throwing the water at the police officers. And you know what's being done to stop it? Hardly anything at all. Why? Well, we don't want to arrest people and upset the community even more. Give them an excuse to riot and do further damage to the social fabric of these fragile communities. The most that they are accused of is a misdemeanor. As far as I know, when you do something like that, it's called assault and battery. But people have lost respect for all authority. And the police officers who risk their lives day in and day out going into various communities, they are subjected to dousing. And the politicians, they're afraid to address the issue. If you could disrespect a police officer, what's the problem with disrespecting the average citizen who has no official place in the community? We've lost a sense of respect. And those are reasons why, some of the reasons why, you have these crimes being perpetrated. Churches play a very important role in society. But yet you'd never know it these days. There's something that has become rather superfluous. There's just for Sunday morning. Yet, studies have been done that where the churches are strong, the community is safe. A number of years ago, maybe 30 years ago, there was a book came out by sociologists Stark and Fink called The Churching of America. The Churching of America. You know what they found is this. When the country was developing the Midwest and Western lands, well, the term Wild West was pretty accurate. It was the Wild West. There was no law and order to speak of until the churches began to settle in the towns. And one of the churches most prominent was the Methodist Church. The Methodist writers, pastors, would go into towns and they would establish a church very quickly in the town. And the more churches there were in the town, the lower went the crime rate. And so the churches do have an important role in society, and yet they have ceded their authority. They have given the secularists, the nihilists, an open field. And that's the reason why today we have the problems that we do. There is a vacuum. We must fill that vacuum. Now, what are some of the things that we can do? Some of you may have heard in your studies about the great awakenings in our society over 300 years. The first one was in the early part of the 18th century, 1740s, around there. And it was a great awakening. Sense of the Spirit, powerful in people's lives, spread across the country. There were great revivals, spiritual revivals. And people had a sense of personal sin and the need for redemption. When do we hear about personal sin and our responsibility for committing sin and the need for redemption? We need another great awakening in this country. The second thing is this. I have yet to hear any of the politicians talk about a national day of prayer to end the violence. A national day of prayer. It's nothing new. I didn't just create this idea from nowhere. Washington called for a national day of prayer. Lincoln, national day of prayer. Franklin Roosevelt, national day of prayer. To what? To pray, to fast, and to seek humiliation. What a word. Seek humiliation. What does that mean? To humble ourselves before God and say, God, we have sinned against you. God, we need your help. God, help us to recreate a good society. Today's reading, we hear about judgment that is going to come. We don't hear much about judgment anymore either. What we hear is a lot about mercy. Maybe it's time we begin to talk about judgment too. For those who do not follow God's law, and those who fail in their obligation to teach the truth, they will be severely judged. Let us not only say we have our thoughts and prayers with those who have suffered injury, those who have been killed and with their families. Let us ask our churches, let us ask our politicians to once again reinsert God in our country. And it's only then that the violence will stop. God love you.